I am Gary Ackerman, president of the Book Club of Washington. I'd like to welcome everyone today to a presentation by Gary Goodman on his book, The Last Bookseller, A Life in the Rare Book Trade. It was published last year by the University of Minnesota Press. Gary will be joined today by his son, Nolan, who through Under the Hill Books defies the title of his dad's book by dealing in fine bindings in pre-1930s fine press books. The Last Bookseller is both a memoir of a life well spent in the used and rare book trade, as well as an account of the business during what may be termed the golden age of the trade before the cataclysmic changes brought about by the internet. Gary helped establish Stillwater, Minnesota, a charming town on the banks of the St. Croix River, not far from Minneapolis, as a book town, certified as such by Richard Booth of Hay on Wye fame. I enjoyed reading Gary's book, how he got started in the business on a whim, his early struggles, and then developing it into one of the most successful bookstores in the country. It is told with both humor and insight. I would like to thank board member Tamara Belts for bringing Gary to our attention. She heard and enjoyed his presentation to the Grolier Club earlier this year. I understand that Nolan is a member of the Grolier Club and probably helped introduce his dad to that club and that event. A word about logistics. As I said, please remain on mute while the presentations are ongoing. Questions can be put into chat, and we should have ample time for Q&A after. I'd like to mention a couple of upcoming programs. We have a virtual tour of the Howard Ironworks Printing Museum located outside of Toronto on July 24. A presentation by Professor Art Cito on important libraries he has visited around the world on August 28th. Art has utilized the facilities at Howard Ironworks in his classes at Ryerson University, where he teaches. And he will help take us on that tour on July 24th. Spencer Stewart will complete his series of talks with one on legacy on August 14th. Information on these events will be posted on our website soon. Well, I'm now going to turn the program over to Gary and Nolan.
All right. Thank you, Gary. I appreciate that. This is officially the second time I've done this talk with my dad. He's been sort of touring the country far and wide in promotion of his book over these past several months. The version with me is something of a sideshow attraction. And so any errors here, technical, grammatical, bibliographical, all should be blamed on me. He's an old hat at this. I'm for all intents and purposes, a newbie. To start off, as one of 6 children, I began working in my dad's bookstore when I was 12 years old, same as all of my siblings. Each kid's job starting out was straightening books, which, was just as fun as it sounds, literally making the spines of the books on all the shelves uniform. And, for what purpose? My 12-year-old brain could only wonder at. We were assured it was both important and in service to the customer. So, once you proved yourself in the stacks, you'd usually graduate to, equally fascinating job of putting Mylar wrappers on dust jackets. And then from there, the next level up was running the front desk. We'd answer questions, do you have the new Harry Potter? No, sorry, not that kind of bookstore. And then someone attempting to buy a book, and me a 15-year-old not knowing what to charge for Minnesota state sales tax. I've got a few, as an accurate record of this time, a few pictures from the 1990s of myself and my siblings kind of hard at work in the bookstore, during that time. So as I got older, things got a bit more interesting. As I'm sure some of you are aware, the rise of the internet plays a significant role in my dad's book. And I can recall my siblings and I pushing my dad to get a computer for the store, a digital camera, and then him uploading his inventory to the Advanced Book Exchange, which is now ABE Books, and then later eBay. I spent every weekend, every summer working in the bookstore, processing orders, assisting customers in book searches, and kind of always wandering through the store, searching for diamonds in the rough that we could sell online. It wasn't until a couple years later that I would start going to other stores to perform those searches so I could sell those books online myself and not have to turn over all the profits to my dad. But overall, it was an amazing and formative experience for me. It instilled a love of books and a love of the book trade that will always be with me. The amount of totally arcane and unusable knowledge I picked up working in the bookstore, which was substantial, is far overshadowed by what I was able to read, witness firsthand, and ultimately, what my dad taught me during that time. Personally, I'm a collector of the book bindings of a man named Lorenz Schwartz, who was an art binder active in the United States from about 1905 to 1930. I began collecting his work about 10 years ago. And shortly thereafter, I realized my dad had a Schwartz binding in his collection. I've got it right here. It's, as you might guess by the title there, it's a copy of the Scarlet Letter. It was bound by Schwartz during his time with the Monastery Hill Bindery in Chicago. A few years after I kind of discovered it on my dad's shelves, he generously gifted the volume to me, and he included the following note inside. Nolan, I know how you book people are, and I worried about getting murdered in my sleep as long as this book was in the house. Have a great birthday. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my dad, Gary Goodman.
Well, Nolan, thank you very much for that great introduction. I have to say that you're in for a treat having Nolan here, because we'll actually have a few pictures. Normally, I don't have pictures because I don't know how to put them up. So that's an improvement. I'd like to thank the Book Club of Washington for having us. It sounds like you guys really have a lot of great programs and a lot of great speakers. So I'm really appreciative that you're having us here. I want to clear up a misconception right at the outset. And that is, although I may look old enough to be the last bookseller, I am not, in fact, the last bookseller. There are still a lot of people who sell books, but as I say in the first paragraph of my book, I might be one of the last of a certain kind of bookseller, the kind that for 600 years rooted around basements, book bins, and bookstores looking for sometimes rare books, or more often secondhand books. They were the hunter-gatherers of the book business, the travelers and pickers who spent their lives saving books that might otherwise have been lost. They are now nearly extinct, driven to ground by the machines, the cell phones, personal computers, and especially the internet that replaced them at the end of the 20th century. Now, I'm one of those species of booksellers who specialize in reselling books, and at the lower levels, these are used books or secondhand books, and then when you go up the line, there are rare books and antiquarian books, and I sold all sorts. I sold $10 books and $1,000 books. So I use the terms interchangeably, and they basically refer to the same thing, and that's books that were previously owned. Some just cost more than others. The book itself is about my nearly 40-year career as a used and rare book dealer. It is in some ways a conventional story, how I started in 1982. Some of the larger than life and interesting people I met, including some of the more notorious criminals who were operating in the later 1990s. Some talk about some of the unusual books I found and the weird places I found them. But the story is also about the dramatic changes that took place in the used and rare book business in the after 2000, largely because of the internet. Before the internet came along, the used and rare book business hadn't changed much since Roman times. When I said 600 years in that first paragraph, I was talking about printed books, which were, of course, came about when Gutenberg printed his Bible in 1440. But there have been reports of people selling secondhand handwritten manuscripts outside the gates of Rome 2,000 years ago. In the United States, used book selling has been part of the American fabric since the country's founding. Benjamin Franklin sold used books, as did Henry Knox, George Washington's Secretary of War. In an earlier, Fort Knox, where they keep all the gold, is named after him. And in an earlier version of the book, I joked that this was somewhat ironic, since the closest that most poor booksellers get to anything gold is the crowns on their teeth. But this didn't make it into the final draft. It has even been suggested that the humble used bookseller, by rescuing and preserving so many significant books and manuscripts over the centuries, has contributed more to Western civilization than most museums or libraries. So the changes that have occurred because of the internet are not, as some would have you believe, on the same order as, say, what happened to phone books or Blockbuster Video or travel agencies. This is an ancient business that's been around since shortly after people started putting words on paper. In more modern terms, as I say in the book, when the internet came along, it was for secondhand booksellers like a lawyer waking up and discovering all his clients had gotten law degrees. Before 2000, it took years of experience to become a successful secondhand bookseller. After 2000, anyone in their pajamas with a box of books, a cup of coffee, and a cable connection could buy and sell books online. Between 1990 and 2000, there were nearly 400 used and rare bookshops in New York City. Now there are fewer than 70. There were almost 50 in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Now there are fewer than 10. The internet wiped out many secondhand booksellers and their traditional bookshops almost overnight. It has been estimated that nearly 70% of the secondhand bookstores around before 2000 have either gone online or have gone out of business. Paradoxically, there are probably more people around now than ever before selling used and secondhand books, simply because the internet, by allowing people to price things and put them online, has made this so much easier to do. Whether or not most of them actually make a living at it is another story. Since the book is subtitled A Life in the Rare Book Trade, let's talk a little bit about how I got into the book business in the first place. It was 1982, and I was working the night shift as a psychiatric counselor on a unit that specialized in treating violent and mentally ill adolescence. I talk about a particularly scary incident in the book, but suffice it to say that I came to the realization that working with people who want to kill you is not a is not a viable long-term profession. And so I definitely was looking for something else to do. One day, my wife came home from and told me that a small used bookstore a few blocks away from us, where we lived in East St. Paul, was going out of business and I should go check it out. So I went to the store, and as I say in the book, it was no bigger than a rich person's walk-in closet. There were books stacked everywhere, Reader's Digest, condensed books, and ratty old paperbacks. And a lot of these older books that I was very intrigued by, because a lot of them were published before the turn of the last century, like say in the 1800s. And I thought, boy, these books really have to be valuable because they're so old. I struck up a conversation with the owner, whose name was Frank, and he told me that he claimed he was closing the store because he had a heart condition. It wasn't because the store was doing poorly or that no one came in. And I have to say that if you know the Twin Cities, East St. Paul is the absolute worst place to have a bookstore. Just to put that out there. But he said he was closing the store because he had a heart condition and he could no longer stand the stress of running the bookstore. And he said he wanted to sell the business, but so far he had no takers. And so I describe what happened next in the book. So I say, the thought of buying a going concern filled with valuable books. I liked books, didn't I? From a man who, but for a heart condition, would not be selling this plum in the middle of East St. Paul made perfect sense. If you sold the business instead of closing it, how much would it be? I asked Frank, just out of curiosity. Frank's eyes lit up at this prospect. Let's see, he said, climbing up on the chair behind the counter and grabbing a pencil. You have your books, 4,000 good books, hand-picked. Then your fixtures, the bookcases, display racks, etc. Then there's the goodwill, the name, the location. I'd probably sell the whole thing for $25,000. $25,000. I could barely pay my rent, much less $25,000. I already worked double shifts on the psychiatric unit 2 or 3 times a week. The car I drove, a 1969 Volvo I bought for $200, didn't have working windshield wipers. That's like not having windshield wipers in Seattle. On cold nights, I had to bring the battery into the house so the car would start in the morning. Frank saw the shock the figure generated. Of course, he continued, I have the heart condition, plus I'd have to move all the books that don't sell. So I'd probably take $10,000. I turned away. I didn't have $10,000 either. But Frank continued to negotiate with himself. Then there's the lease on the store, he said, which runs another 3 months. I'll be on the hook for that. So I'm thinking, I'd hate to do it, but I'd take $2,000 for the whole thing. He paused, no reaction from me. On a contract for deed at $100 a month. I perked up, and nothing down, he added. And that's how I became the owner of a used bookstore in East St. Paul. So that was a pretty inauspicious beginning. Even at this bargain basement. Nolan, you want to show a picture of the Arcade Street store? There it is. There's the Arcade Street store. But even at this bargain basement price, this turned out to be a horrible decision. I found out later that Frank's 4,000 hand-picked books were the leftovers he picked up from every estate, library, and book sale in town. Books he rescued on the way to a dumpster. I had another bookseller come over, Larry Dingman, who's was a prominent Minneapolis bookseller, and he came over and looked around for about 10 minutes and turned to me and he said, "This is the worst, most picked over stock of books I've ever seen in my life." And that, I mean, that's saying something. So, but still, like so many before me, I became fascinated by the secondhand book business. During my first years on Arcade Street, I muddled through working the night shift and working the night shift at the hospital and running the store during the day. One thing I did was start going to estate and library sales. And as I say in the book, it was there that I met the denizens of the book buying underworld. From the book, again, some of the most educated and honorable people I have ever met were in the book business, but some of the most unsavory and illiterate were in the book business too. Those who operated at my low level, and some I met as I moved up the ranks, could be strange and troubled individuals. Loners, survivalists, and petty criminals regularly bought and sold used books on the open market. I was new, unfamiliar with their rituals and hierarchy, a curiosity to the other book people. "Are you the idiot who bought Frank's store in East St. Paul?" they would ask. It took me 4 more years to learn the business and 8 years actually to start making enough of a living selling secondhand books to quit the hospital job. And you could say that I'm a slow learner, but I eventually had 6 kids, and so I had to figure out how to make a living for them too. I eventually figured the book business out. I started a book search service and moved to Stillwater, where with a couple of partners, I started St. Croix Antiquarian Booksellers and the Stillwater Book Center. This was so successful and caused so many other booksellers to move to town that Richard Booth, the founder of the first book town in Wales and the self-proclaimed king of Hay-on-Wye, came over in 1994 and declared Stillwater the first book town in North America. In the book, I talk about traveling to Hay-on-Wye and to Archer City, Texas, another book town started by Larry McMurtry, the famous author of books like Lonesome Dove and The Last Picture Show. There's a picture of his. He had 4 stores in Archer City. There were probably 500 people in the whole town, and each store was named Booked Up number 1, Booked Up number 2, and so he had 500,000 books within this small town. Anyway, I talk a lot about that and about the Hay-on-Wye store, or the Hay-on-Wye Booktown. The Hay-on-Wye Booktown began in the late 1960s when Richard Booth began buying up books that libraries in the UK were discarding and he put these books in abandoned buildings around his hometown in Hay. Eventually, this attracted book buyers and also other booksellers. And eventually the town became known, Hay became known as the town of books. Booth was pretty eccentric and had a genius for publicity. And so I say in the book, describing how he established his book town, I say, after a run-in with the Wales Tourist Board in 1977, Booth declared Hay an independent nation and appointed himself king. This generated enormous publicity. 6 television stations came to Hay to listen to him explain why the town was no longer part of the United Kingdom. The Hay Air Force, a biplane, made a fly past. A rowing boat was launched as the Hay Navy, and the sovereign retired to the pub to name his government. It was April Fool's Day, and the king was wearing a crown made out of tinfoil. The orb and scepter were made from the contents of a toilet. King Richard issued passports and printed money for the Kingdom of Hay. He appointed a Hay House of Lords and installed his horse as the prime minister. Like Booth, the author Lyric McMurtry bought up a bunch of abandoned buildings in his hometown and filled them with 500,000 books, as I said. You can read about my travels to these two book towns, but I think the point here is that they show how popular used and rare books were in the later 1990s. These book towns generated an enormous amount of publicity. I also talk in the book about some of the direct and sometimes glancing contact I had with some of the more notorious criminals of the era, including Stephen Bloomberg, who lived in St. Paul and was probably one, and was known as the Book Bandit, and was probably one of the most prolific book thieves in history. He was arrested in 1992 for stealing 23,600 books worth an estimated $20 million. He would come into the store on Arcade Street, that little dump, and which showed you how no venue was too small for his attention. And he'd come in and stand in the entryway, and you know, he obviously had some mental problems, but he would stand in the entryway and look around with his googly eyes and wouldn't say anything and just walk out. And he did this a few times. And one day I went up to him and I asked him if I could help him. And he said, well, do you have a rare book room? And I said, well, not only do I not have a rare book room, I don't even think I have any rare books. And with that, he left and never came back. And when I later found out who he was, I was mildly insulted that he didn't bother looking around to see if I had anything worth stealing. John Jenkins was another famous book criminal that I had some contact with. He bought books from me through the mail. He was the so-called Texas bookmaker who at one time was the president of the American Booksellers Association, which is about as high as you can get in the secondhand book business. But he became so enmeshed in gambling and loan sharking and forgeries that he eventually was found dead in the middle of the Colorado River. And there's some question as to whether he committed suicide or was murdered, and I talk about that mystery in the book as well. Through the story of my bookselling career, The Last Bookseller tries to put what happened to the secondhand book business because of the internet in some context. The transition from traveling booksellers and their personalized bookshops to the largely impersonal internet has probably been the most significant change to the book business since the invention of the printing press. I think one of the, and also as an aside, I think a fundamental change has occurred in the sort of in the attitude of people towards books, in that I think before the internet, even people who didn't buy that many books or read that many books, they'd look at a shelf of books and they'd really realize that that's where they would find all the answers to things. And now I think that has changed or shifted to people feeling that they can find the answers and facts or meaning on the internet. So As I say in the book, so the kind of bookseller I'm talking about here is a vanishing breed. Before the last dog dies, I wanted to describe what it was like to make a living in this curious and unconventional business. I traveled enough throughout the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, and saw enough to know my experiences reflect the changes that occurred in bookselling at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. These stories are told from my perspective, but are meant to give a realistic picture of this age-old occupation. The booksellers I described here might not be the last ones, but they are likely the last of their kind. And with that, I will turn it back over to Gary and see if you have any questions.
I don't see anything in the chat room yet, but I have a couple either questions or observations. One is that this may be a theme for the book club this year. Earlier, we had a presentation by Ross King on his book, The Last Bookseller of Florence.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Vespasiano. And
Right.
yeah, we did that jointly with the Book Club of California and had just a terrific response.
Yeah.
And it was, and you mentioned Vespasiano, I believe, in one part of your book.
Yes.
You're talking about that. And it was at that time, it was the effect of the printing press that drove him out of the business of producing and selling manuscripts, which he was the best. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's
yeah.
That's an interesting perspective on what's happened to
bookends.
Yeah, that's right.
Really. The other thing I wanted to just comment on was something you said, and maybe perhaps Nolan can comment on this, is the amount of time and the how much time it takes to become an accomplished rare book dealer. The knowledge that you have to have. You go to rare book schools. I think those are probably no doubt helpful, but I don't think anything replaces the kind of grassroots experience, Gary, that you had, learning it from the ground up.
No.
Could you comment on that? And
well, I actually have the big issue with, and again, this is before the internet, where you really, as a used and secondhand book dealer, you really had to know what was happening. You really had to know what the books that had a market and the books that were because there's an ebb and flow in terms of the popularity of certain books. And I say in another part of the book, I say, if you figure that every book that goes out of print is technically a secondhand book, the used book universe is about 300 times larger than the new book universe. And then quoting from the book, I say Google Books recently calculated that there have been 130 million individual titles published since the invention of the printing press. Over 700,000 new titles come out every year. And actually, I think there's probably 1.5 million with self-publishing and all that kind of thing. According to Louis Busby's The Yellow Lighted Bookshop, if you read one book a week, starting at age 5, and live to be 80, you will have read a grand total of 3,900 books. For that really, that would fill a room like this, but relative to how many books there are, that's not many. So that's a little over 1/10 of 1% of the books currently in print. Current bestsellers have print runs of 2 million or more, but assume over time that the average print run is 2,500 copies. That's 335 billion physical books that have been printed since the invention of the printing press. And the smallest fraction will have a demand on the secondhand market. So the reason it took so long for secondhand booksellers and rare book dealers to learn the trade is simply because of the vast amount of material that they had to be familiar with. And it's not that they had to be familiar with every individual title or every book, but they had to be familiar with the best books in chemistry or biography. So they had to have certain parameters, and the only way to learn that was through experience. So anyway, when the internet came along, that introduced order and efficiency into the secondhand book business, and also competition. And for a lot of reasons, this has been good news for collectors and the consumer, but it's been bad news for booksellers, because the way that they would make their living often was to find books for people and to but anyway, and then I say in the book, because of the internet, the availability of secondhand books soared and prices plummeted. This was especially hard on mid-range book dealers who own most of the secondhand shops. The demand for a good portion of the books they relied on to make a living dropped like day-old donuts. Before, booksellers had to know the price and market for books. Once this information was everywhere, booksellers had no competitive advantage over anyone else. This is a very lengthy answer to your question, Gary, but I think it's really crucial to understanding what exactly happened. And a good example of that is the A.B. Bookman's Weekly. I don't know how many would remember that, but this was a publication that came out every week, and often was the size of a small town phone book. It was a thick catalog, and it had page after page of books wanted. And then there's at the back, there were books for sale. But this was the central organizing principle of the secondhand rare book business. And that is that if you wanted a book on Hemingway, or if Nolan wanted a Lorenz Schwartz book, you had to go to a secondhand book dealer to get it. And the way that you would get it is you'd go and say, I'm looking for a first edition of The Sun Also Rises. Can you find it for me? And they'd say, well, yeah, give me $10 or $5. And they would put an ad in the A.B. Bookman's Weekly. And then eventually, so that would take maybe a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, and the ad would appear. And then if another bookseller saw the ad, they would write a quote and tell the bookseller, I've got this book and this is how much it is. Well, the point is that.
And it was all done by mail, right?
It was all done by mail. It was all, the booksellers would fill out these little postcards, put them in the mail, and it was so, a very primitive process. And you can see that once the internet came along, you can go online and find virtually any book you're looking for in 30 seconds. And so if you take away that, even that way of the revenue for a secondhand bookseller, you can see how significant that was.
So one of the members of the book club who was here in Seattle, but has recently moved to California, he is going to defy the internet and deal with collectors directly
Mhm.
and deal with them essentially by either by catalog, which is, as you know, expensive to do,
Yeah.
but try to develop the personal relationship with the collector that was the hallmark of the golden age of book dealing. So I think there may be some. The question is whether there's, and maybe Nolan is trying to do this with his fine bindings.
I would, yeah, actually, I think Nolan is doing that right now. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's kind of the organizing principle of your business.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes a special, you've got to have kind of the right types of books. You have to have a network of collectors that are willing to buy those books. You have to be able to put, kind of spend the money to make sure that and with confidence that, oh yes, person X they're gonna want this. But yeah, I mean, I would say, because I focus so, I just very on really specific items, it's been probably easier for me to find the types of collectors that are really interested in those types of things. My dad's store, sort of hunting and fishing, children's books, knowing that all of that information and what types of books are going to appeal to someone on Stillwater's Main Street walking in on a Saturday is a totally different type of thing. So yeah, I mean, I would say of a few of the other dealers that I know, I mean, I think that is a big part of kind of how you can be successful now is having those, having those types of relationships and knowing people that are really, really dedicated collectors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here's a question for you then, Nolan. Do you work full time? Do you have a physical storefront, which I'm suspecting you don't, or do you work mostly online?
All online. Yep. No. So I have a day job, and this is kind of my, it was I started collecting and I collecting these book bindings, and then ultimately sort of, with all of the connections that I was making, I sort of thought to myself, I could probably, start selling. I feel like I know enough and I know the market and I got some good connections. So yeah, it's all online and sort of my my second job, I would say.
Yeah, right. There was another question here about Wigtown. Apparently that was a kind of a book town.
Yeah.
How it's doing right now. Yeah, does Sean Bethel write to support the store? I guess that must be the kind of the owner, or just write an interesting story. So somebody else here knows about Wigtown.
Yeah, he's written several books about the town, and they're mostly in the form of diaries, where he talks about the people he meets, and they're quite humorous. Although I think he's running out of material, and so he's sort of writing books to make money. Yeah, it is in Scotland, by the way. Now, but yeah, he's I don't know if he writes to support the store or not. I don't. It probably doesn't hurt, I guess.
Yeah. So it's in Scotland. Is that what you said?
Yeah, in Scotland. Yeah.
Where in June?
I'm not sure where exactly it is.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, I'm not sure where.
It's in. Oh, I see. All I get is it's in southwest Scotland.
Southwest.
Uh-huh. So near Glasgow, I guess, or south of Glasgow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know that area from the golf courses, but not from. Let's see. Well, a question here whether there's this is Tamara, really wondering whether there's a difference in the book culture between the UK and the US. Do you think there are more used and rare bookstores still sprinkled around the UK in that respect than there are here.
I think there are, when I first started going there were, every medium-sized town had a used and rare bookshop, or it had a bookshop in it downtown. It was kind of like so it was really a treasure trove for the traveling American book dealer to go to these stores. And of course, nothing is online. So, you would be paying £2 for books you could sell for $100 in the United States. I remember buying a set of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings trilogy in one of those shops.
Wow.
First editions and dust jackets, and bringing it back and selling it. And of course, now it would sell for probably $50,000, that set. But I think there are still a lot of hangers on. I was just in England maybe a year or so ago, and you'll see these stores, and they're all guys my age, just hanging on, and normally there's nobody there, and they're having a cup of tea, and but it's I think that they tend to hang on a little longer than the ones have in the United States, not as mercenary about it as U.S. dealers.
Yeah, one of the things I got through your book was that perhaps the higher quality rare book dealers in the UK did not go out into the hinterlands to look for books. It was perhaps considered beneath them to do that.
Well, it was maybe beneath them, but it was also because they had so many books there.
Oh, I see. They didn't really need to.
They had such a big supply of if you live in London or anywhere, any population center, they just had books coming out of their ears. And so a lot of these, for us to go to these smaller towns, it was really, quite exciting to walk into these stores that it just had not been picked over by any other book dealers. So it really was amazing.
Yeah, you talk about your partner, who was the military history.
Paul Kisselberg. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Kisselberg, and how he had his rolls of pounds. Because it's all there were no credit cards.
Right.
It was all cash, and eyes would light up.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, and that this kind of harkens back to the ability to buy books, is that I also talk about this in the book, is that everything, when I say in the book that it was like a lawyer waking up and discovering that all his clients had gotten law degrees. Well, everybody all of a sudden knew what everything was worth. So if you went to New York, where you could pick up a copy of the St. Croix River, which is the river that runs right near Stillwater, you could buy a copy of that for $2. Once the internet came along, the guy in New York, he put it online, he looked it up, and so everywhere you went, the copy of the St. Croix River was $20. So your ability to travel like that and to buy books that were underpriced so that you could bring them back and resell them just became harder and harder until a lot of dealers now don't travel at all to buy books, whereas in the later 90s, they traveled all the time. I mean, people travel 2 weeks a month buying books. So
I guess there's maybe perhaps a silver lining to that when you talk about your family and your family life. But it does take, because all that travel does take.
Oh
a
yeah,
toll.
I hated the travel, especially when you got 6 kids and you're calling home and
Yeah.
Nolan is eating some poison berries. That's you know
Again?
again. Yeah, I told him.
Yeah, those are some rough times. No doubt.
And, I gotta say, we're probably running to the end here, but I love, Gary, I love the letter or the note that your son Colin sent you or wrote, saying, if you read this, I'm dead.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
You kept the back room unheated, essentially. And,
yeah.
Oh,
They had a hard life, those kids.
yeah, oh yeah, really, I'm sure they did. So I just want to say how much I enjoyed your book. I encourage everybody here that hasn't read it to read it. It's told with such humor, as I mentioned before, and we've just been delighted to have you and Nolan here today to share your experiences, even though they're bittersweet, really, for many of us who love to go into the real bookstores.
Right.
Yeah. So I got to say, I just went into one in Anacortes. There's a nice bookstore there, Pelican Bay Books.
Yeah.
The guy's just expanded. He's got a very nice, very nicely curated bookstore, well lit. They sell coffee and probably T-shirts, but
Right. Yeah.
But he has recently, I think, expanded into new space, and so it's encouraging. And it may take a charming town. It takes a certain environment, I think, a well-educated population. A lot of retirees are up there. It's a very bookish sort of area. And
well, you have to sell an experience now instead of just a book in some way.
Yeah, really. So.
Well, thank you very much, Gary, and everyone for showing up. I really appreciate you having us here. And
yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's a great way to spend a Sunday afternoon.
Right.
Okay. I'm gonna. Any other questions? If anybody has anything, we can raise a hand. I don't know that I have every. But I'm going to assume I see a thank you. So there we go.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.